Well, Happy New Year and welcome back to Sacred Synergy. Episode 4 of the podcast features Brian McLaren, who is an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian. Brian started as a college English teacher, he then became a pastor, and he has become a passionate advocate for what he calls a new kind of Christianity, one that is just, generous, and working with people of all faiths for the common good. Brian is a faculty member with the Center for Action and Contemplation, and he hosts the CAC's podcast called Learning How to See. Brian is a co-host of the Southern Lights Conference, and he supports a new progressive ecumenical campus ministry network called Zoe. Brian has written more than 20 books, including his newest, The Last Voyage, published in 2025, and it's the first installment in a science fiction trilogy. He also mentions his other book over the course of this podcast, Life After Doom, which is particularly relevant to the topics of our conversation today, where he speaks to this era of a multi-crisis and how we are called to a more compassionate and contemplative perspective in approaching the complex issues of our time. Brian and his wife have 4 adult children and now 5 grandchildren, and they live near the Gulf of Mexico in southwestern Florida, where Brian is able to engage his interests that include wildlife, ecology, fly fishing, kayaking, music, songwriting, literature, and I'm sure a whole lot more, as you will see and that we touch on in our conversation today. And I really enjoyed talking with Brian and being in the presence of his wisdom. I have to admit that there is something special for me about people who are married with families that are committed and respected spiritual teachers and leaders. I don't say that to throw shade at those who have taken a vow of celibacy, yet to not have a life where you have a dependence and a spouse is to at least some degree a life that is much more convenient. I think that more than anything, this dynamic speaks to the increasing consciousness in the world, whereby we come to realize that turning to institutions for answers, especially for our spiritual inquiries, is not always the best course of action, especially in the current age where many institutions seem to be teetering on the brink of collapse if they are not already in a free fall. Brian and I cover this topic and others in greater detail in our conversation. And one of the other things that I appreciate from my time with Brian is his experience with integrating the natural world into his practice of theology and ministry. There are at least a few times in the course of our discussion where we cite examples from creation that help to demonstrate points or to paint a fuller picture of the concepts that we tend to explore from more abstract perspectives via theology and philosophy. So Brian helps give form to our understanding of how contemplative spirituality can be embodied and applied in real ways, namely in the context of our evolving lives and in these evolutionary and revolutionary times. It was a pleasure to fold Teilhard de Chardin into our conversation. Teilhard was really our connecting point that brought us together for this discussion today. And as you will find, our conversation weaves in many other subjects, from biology to theology to social action, as well as those living examples. Brian is a gifted teacher, and you can dive deeper into his work by reading one of the many books he has authored, as well as checking out his podcast with the Center for Action and Contemplation. There are links in the show notes to the different places where you can find Brian and connect with him online. Remember that the American Teilhard Association's annual event and retreat will be held from May 29th through 31st at Dalesford Abbey in Paoli, Pennsylvania. The theme of this year's event is Reimagining a Universe in the Making, Teilhard and Process Theology, featuring Dr. Don Viney as our plenary speaker. And you can find out more information at teilharddechardin.org about the upcoming retreat. And if you are watching the video of this episode, you may notice that I am wearing a fleece that says Dalesford Abbey. So I would like to give a plug for the Abbey, where I am grateful to serve as the director of the Spirituality and Retreat Center. The Abbey is located in the countryside of Chester County, Pennsylvania, and rests on over 80 beautiful acres. You can find out more about the Abbey, including how to make a private retreat or to schedule a visit, by going to dalesford.org. And with that, we are ready to sit down with Brian McLaren for a conversation at the heart of evolution. So Brian, thank you so much for being with us on Sacred Synergy.
I've really been looking forward to this.
As have I. It's been great to make your acquaintance and to be connected with you. It was through a mutual friend, Joan McManus. And she's actually connected me with a couple of guests now that we've had on the podcast. So grateful for her and these relationships she's facilitated this way. So, Brian, please introduce yourself and please tell us a little bit about what you do with most of your time in the world.
Sure. Well, I'll give a short little biography. I grew up, I was born in upstate New York, way out in the country, which is where, in many ways, my love for nature and the outdoors began. Uh, but spent most of my life in the DC area. I began my career as a college English teacher. I loved literature and writing, and then I ended up becoming part of a little experimental faith community that formed and eventually became a church. And I left teaching and became a pastor. I served as a pastor of this interdenominational congregation outside the DC area or in the DC suburbs. I served there for 24 years. During that time, I started writing books. And for the last 20 years, I've been writing and speaking, and I have the chance to be involved in a lot of activist causes that I'm interested in. I'm married. My wife Grace and I have 4 adult children and 5 amazing grandchildren. I can show you pictures later. And what I spend my time these days, I've been traveling and speaking a lot. I'm actually taking a little sabbatical from speaking. So right now I'm writing fiction and nonfiction and enjoying being outdoors all that I can.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And I had commented before we press record here that with your guitars in the background, your work with the environment, you're a very multidimensional person. So, very grateful for you in the midst of this sabbatical for giving your time with us today. So, could you describe a little bit of your own personal evolution there? You've covered, done a lot of things with many lives, right?
Yeah.
So, how did you end up evolving from, you eventually were a teacher, became a pastor, and then you worked into becoming an author, speaker, activist. So, can you describe that evolution a
Sure.
little bit?
Well, the word evolution is a good word to use because what started to get me in trouble is that I grew up in this very conservative Protestant background that were very literalistic in the readings of the Bible. So they were absolutely against evolution. And as a little kid, I just loved nature. And I checked out every book on animals and plants and forests and stars and oceans and all that sort of thing. Every book in the library for kids. So then I went to the adult section and I would check out high school and college textbooks. I just had this insatiable curiosity about the natural world. And and evolution just made so much sense to me. I was taken with it. Literally at 7 or 8 years old, I just thought, what an amazing process. And it sure matched everything that I experienced in the natural world. And so that set me at odds to some degree with my religious heritage. I pretty much thought I would leave religion because, I guess like a lot of kids, you grow up and your form of religion is the only form you know about. So if that doesn't work, you think, well, let me just be done with this whole thing. But I ended up having a kind of kind of intense spiritual experiences during my teenage years that kept me on the path. But somehow I felt inside of me, I just had to have permission to think differently than my religious heritage. And so that put me into it with a deep spiritual commitment, but also a lot of spiritual curiosity. And interestingly, especially in light of when we'll talk about Teilhard de Chardin, but it was a number of Catholic writers who really had a huge influence on me. Among them, first was the novelist Walker Percy. When I was in graduate school, I stumbled upon him. And then that just led one thing into another, where I felt like my spiritual, how would I say it? I felt like my spiritual ancestors, metaphorically speaking, the people who
Yeah.
I was learning from came from many different streams, and
Okay.
that had a long-term effect on me.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, when I was a kid, I was particularly taken by the biological sciences, like
Yeah,
yourself, nature, animals, plants.
yeah.
It's quite interesting now because my parents are in process of moving out of the home that they raised me and my sisters in,
Mm.
and they're downsizing, so they're emptying out this space, and a lot of it's ending up in my garage and my other sisters' garages. But a lot of it, my mom has saved stuff from when I was little. And there are these nature books and
Yeah.
rainforest books. And now my kids are opening them up with just these
Uh,
sparkles in their eyes. And it's like, I like feel like almost like carbonation inside of me, these bubbles coming
uh,
up, so it's really cool to kind of revisit that with new eyes. So when you said that, it immediately brought that to mind. This was like the
yeah.
other day this happened. My son was
So
looking at this
great.
book. Yeah,
So
yeah.
great. So great.
Yeah, so you mentioned Teilhard, who, for myself, like yourself, when I was kind of growing up in my teens and then into my early adulthood, I was really struggling with my Catholicism and, well, the Catholicism I was raised with, and then the observations and experiences I was having with the world until I found this guy, Teilhard de Chardin. And I was like, oh
Mhm.
my gosh, this guy gets it. He's able to put it into a religious context that makes sense, theological context. So I'm interested, how and when did you
Yeah.
first meet Teilhard?
So it's interesting. I very clearly remember when I was first introduced to Teilhard. I was an undergraduate and I attended uh, this seminar, and the speaker spent it was like a 5 day seminar, and on the second or third day, the speaker spent a whole hour saying how wrong Teilhard was, how terrible he was, and he'd read quotes that then he would attack. And I just remember thinking, I have a feeling I agree a lot more with this guy that's being attacked than I do with the guy who's doing the attacking. So that was literally my first exposure. It was some years before I read Teilhard himself. And and in many ways, I think I was more influenced by the people Teilhard had influenced
Mm.
than I was directly from his own writings. So, for example, Teilhard had such a huge influence on Thomas Berry, and I would have to say Thomas Berry has been one of the greatest influences on my own life, of anyone. Had a huge influence. He, in many ways, he in the Catholic world was exploring something that came to be known as process theology, evolutionary theology. And in the Protestant world, John Cobb, a Methodist theologian, was someone who picked up on that work in the Protestant world. John Cobb had a huge influence on me. In recent, the last decade or decade and a half, it's been a great joy to become friends with Sister Ilia Delio, who in many ways is one of the people carrying Teilhard's torch today. So, and in fact, just last night, coincidentally, before I was falling asleep, I picked up a book. It's many years old. I think it might be 50 years old now, by a Catholic priest and scholar named Albert Nolan. And as I'm reading into the chapters here, I'm just realizing how much he was influenced by Teilhard as well.
Wow.
So I just found, in many ways, he was the first one to dare to say evolution is a feature of creation, and therefore it is revelatory about the nature of God. And because he so courageously crossed that line and suffered for it in so many ways, but never backed off,
Yeah.
many others then could pick up that work. And I feel like so many of us, you probably feel the same way. We're continuing the work that he began.
Yeah, I do feel that. And like you said, it's often through the inspiration of these other people that we've been fortunate enough to come into some sort of encounter with, of influence, that we find maybe we learn some of his
Mhm.
teaching in more depth and in a way that we can apply it more to our lives in more of a live sense. Because I know when I'm reading him, I have to read like one paragraph at a time.
Yeah.
And I was actually, one of my mentors from grad school said this is how he was taught to read Rahner. read it like a meditation. Just read
Yes.
even one
Yes.
line at a time, a few words at a time. And if you have to, just sit on that. And
Yeah.
that's how I then started to approach Teilhard. And also, like my mentor said, it'll then be when you're doing something that you wouldn't expect, like changing a diaper or, making soup, that all of a sudden it just clicks and it makes sense what this guy was trying to elaborate on. So, yeah, thankfully we have such powerful and prominent teachers that have been able to, like you said, carry that torch. And in some way, we're also a part of that. So it's a daunting challenge, but I'll embrace it.
Yes. And I mean, it's one of the things to me that's just so breathtaking about Teilhard. Uh, to think that, well, first of all, I am intrigued with Charles Darwin, and I did a lot of research on Charles Darwin for a book that I wrote. And you realize the emotional pain and the emotional intimidation of speaking some things that you know are going to make the religious establishment hate you and see you as the devil. Um, and yet to persist and to get on with your work and to try to do it faithfully. And and Darwin had to do this when his main feet were in the quote secular world.
Yeah.
But then in the religious world for Teilhard to do this, yeah, it's just amazing.
It is, yeah. When you talk about some of those themes within his work, from evolution, which is a very arduous process, it's usually not a glamorous one. It's usually one that involves a lot of suffering and turmoil. You talk about his struggle with embracing that as a reality, as fundamental to his outlook on the world, and then leaning into it.
Yes.
And in his case, that was with his religious community, with the Vatican. So it wasn't easy. So, how would you say that you apply personally some of those lessons learned from Teilhard, or even just elements of his vision with unity, maybe, to your own life and work?
Yes. 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 Well, maybe let me speak sort of generally first, and then I'll try to be a little bit more personal.
Sure.
Um, Many of us inherited forms of theology that are deeply rooted in a certain kind of Neoplatonism. And we don't need to get, I mean, we can get as technical as you'd like, but to try to keep this on an accessible level for folks.
Sure. Sure.
In some ways, that form of Neoplatonism says that the ultimate reality is static and unchanging. And in that way, if God as the ultimate reality is static and unchanging, to live in a world of change is to be out of sync
Mm.
with the creator. And it creates this huge disconnect between our understanding of what God is supposed to be and what reality is supposed to be. And in that way, it increases this sense that they're in two very different worlds. Some philosophers call this a kind of ontological dualism, that reality exists in the world of unchanging spirit and changing matter. And I remember so feeling that was unsatisfactory for so many years. But I didn't know that you were allowed to be a Christian and to question it. And really, I mean, this is where Teilhard, in my mind, is such, he bursts through that, impermeable barrier between the unchanging eternal and the changing temporal, and says, no, we have permission to look at the unfolding evolutionary process and see this as the way that the divine gives birth, that this is a labor process. It's a creative, life-giving process. And I suppose the reason I have to go to that sort of meta level to start is to say what a gift that is to make it possible for many of us to love God,
Mm.
who never could wholeheartedly feel that we could love this unchanging, separate potentate above everything, either controlling it, maybe occasionally, as Barbara Brown Taylor said, reaching in and stirring it with a stick, um, uh, but instead of seeing God as that distant, separated, controlling, supreme being, to understand God's very nature as being in the birth-giving process, and not just in the ancient past, but in this moment as well. And how that affects my life is it helps me see my life and my work and my daily actions as participating in that divine milieu, as Teilhard said. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I like the analogy that he gives at some point about the human person being like a molecule, I think it is, within
Yes.
this larger operation, within a larger entity.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think actually says we are a mega molecule, I think is the word he might use, because we're an
Yes.
assemblage of many of those, right? So yeah, it's certainly inspiring to know that we have a purpose within this universe, and
Yes.
it is daunting at the same time too, because it's like, okay, what's my purpose, right? And
Yes.
I think back to like the church fathers and the glory of God is the human person fully alive.
Yes.
Well, what enables you, what encourages you
Yes.
to be fully alive, right? And yeah, that's an inspiring thing and a totally different look at, I think, theology too, in a way.
Yes. In fact, I remember one of Teilhard's short works. He wrote. Oh, you'll be able to remind me of the title, but he wrote a mass in celebration of matter,
The Mass
um,
on the World.
the Mass on the World.
Yeah.
And I remember when I read that again, it was this gift because so many of us inherited this idea that God is all about spirit, and
Mm.
that in some ways God can't wait to get creation done with because all this matter is messy and all the rest, and God can't wait to get that done with so all the spirits can be sucked out and put up in heaven where everything is clean and unchanging and so on. And I mean, that might sound sort of silly, but I think there are a whole lot of us who we felt that was the only way we could be faithful Christians, was to accept that. And just as Teilhard said, change is a revelation of God. Teilhard saw matter as mattering, and matter as being sacred.
Yeah, in addition to the Mass on the World, he also has this beautiful poem and prayer called A Hymn to Matter.
Yes, yes.
It's very special to me, but there's this line toward the end of it where he talks about, I'm going to mess up the exact quote, but it's something to the effect of seeking God in the realms where saints think to avoid you.
Yes, yes, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And you and I are having this conversation in Advent season, which should have told us that God wasn't that opposed to matter. If we take this understanding of the incarnation seriously. And it reminds me of one of my favorite Christmas season pieces, O Magnum Mysterium. I love Malcolm Lauritsen's version of it. If people look it up, O Magnum Mysterium. And I don't have it's in Latin, but the words are just this very material thing that God appears to us in the I mean the physical womb of a woman, and born with the breath of cattle and the smell of hay and this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not only important to me for what it says about the divine, but it's also important for the way that it lifts up and dignifies all of the created world. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple levels there from, the level of looking at those who are on the margins and, where
Yes.
God chooses to manifest in
Yes.
that way and incarnate, to, like you said, our relationship with the natural world and how when we live in this age of immersion within high technology, it's inescapable. I mean, you can try
Yes.
and avoid it all you want, but it's really quite difficult. We really need that deep connection with the biosphere in order to hopefully,
Oh my.
yeah, work toward a sense of equilibrium because I
And
think we're a little off balance now.
I'm so glad you said that, because just as there was a kind of Neoplatonic philosophy that sucked us out of the natural world into this conceptual, abstracted world, I think there is a kind of technology that sucks us out of the biosphere and puts us in the cybersphere or puts us in the of course, Teilhard has this rich and beautiful term noosphere, but
Right.
that's far different than this this sort of mechanistic binary cyberspace that many of us have, that more and more of our lives are sucked into, right? And there are an awful lot of people who have not had their feet walk on pine needles in a long time, or
Yeah.
have not had their feet walk through fallen leaves in a long time, or have not gotten their feet wet in a stream, or have not shuffled their feet through dry, freshly fallen snow in a long time. And we realize we create this conceptual, imaginary, virtual world, and we need to be reconnected,
Hmm.
probably for our sake, for the world's sake, and for God's sake altogether. And I also appreciate what you said about that. This also means that the humblest and most easily forgotten person suddenly becomes important again in a new way. Just before we started this call, I'm working on some writing because I'll be part of a gathering at Alligator Alcatraz right near where I live, where we have on every Sunday afternoon there's a multi-faith gathering just for people to gather and say the people who are being detained, their matter, and we're not going to let them be hidden away and disappeared. We're going to be in solidarity with them and their families, and all of this, flows from the vision that Teilhard opened up for so many people.
Yeah, it comes from that vision, and it's one that encourages us to really not just put our feet to the fire, but really to put our entire being into the
Yeah,
fire. Teilhard prayed this prayer of annihilation. He prayed to be annihilated so that anything inauthentic would be washed away, in a sense, eroded away, in his paleontological mind.
yes,
So yeah, I mean, you touch on something there in terms of your service, in terms of your advocacies. Teilhard's vision is also one of challenge too, because it calls us to that gospel challenge to serve. So, I mean, where would you say that you are probably most challenged from his vision? Although you spoke of it in a very affirming sense, it's like so affirming. So I don't want to like it, not a negative sense, but like where
yeah,
are you really tested
yeah,
within that vision?
yeah, yeah. Well, um, I think I wrote a book a couple of years ago about our current multi-crisis situation called Life After Doom. And as I was writing that book, I came to feel how much the what people often call the myth of progress is still alive in me. Now, in one sense, Teilhard, as I understand Teilhard, is deeply optimistic in the sense of that the arc of history bends toward justice and bends toward increasing beauty and harmony, and everything that rises must converge. Um, but as a paleontologist, he had very long time frames in mind.
Hmm.
And I think one of the things that challenges me, especially as I get older, is to realize, in the big arc of time, our role is in a very, very small little sliver of it. And we do what we can, but but that sense, it's a sense of humility. It's this paradox. It's the dignity of being part of the unfolding universe and the humility of being a very, very small part.
Yeah, the humility is very important because, like you said, we have to consider the scale of time, of space, matter.
Yeah,
It is very intimidating and can make us feel so small. But the humility, I think, then lends us that grace or an
yeah,
openness to the grace to be able to do something with that smallness that we have.
yeah.
On an episode that I just recorded with a couple of friends from the Teilhard organization, the quote came to mind of every gardener is inherently a futurist. And it's almost mid-December here in Pennsylvania, and I haven't planted my garlic yet, so I'm like behind, and the ground's freezing. But I like saw today the forecast was going to be a little bit warmer. There was supposed to be some rain, maybe snow. And I was like, well, I can take advantage of a bad day, what most would call a bad
Yes.
weather day, to use that softer ground to finally get my garlic in the soil. And all of that is really just, is it for the next garlic harvest or is it for the future in that way,
Yes.
right? It's such a
You
small
know,
thing I'm doing, but it
yes,
can,
yes,
yeah.
exactly. One of the joys of my adult life has been becoming friends with and a colleague with Father Richard Rohr at the Center for Action and Contemplation. And Richard has this little saying, comes up again and again. He says, in the second half of life, we learn that life is not about us, but we are about life.
Mm,
And this, to me, is a very profound statement that we're here. I'm writing some science fiction right now, and I just finished the second of a trilogy, and a character at the end of this second novel who's working in a garden says, I used to think that the plants were here to serve us, that they were part of Team Human. And now I sometimes think, no, we're here to serve the plants. We're part of Team Plant. And it's just, well, no, we're all part of Team Life. And there's
yeah.
this bigger life that we all get to be part of. And what I feel like our species is going to have to learn this. It's just going to have to be
Mm,
one of the basic things, as basic to us as 2 + 2 = 4, is that
yeah.
we're part of team life. Because right now we either think everything is team me, that everybody should cooperate to maximize my happiness, or everything is team us, everything exists for our nation, or team human, everything should support human beings. But no, and maybe this is where Teilhard was helping point us very gently that when we speak of God, it's not God apart from creation, but it's God in and through creation. To love God then includes loving everything God loves, which includes all of every sparrow that falls, as Jesus said, every little flower, single little wildflower in the field.
Yeah, beautifully said. And as we are within this time of transition, we, I think, are seeing the degradation of a lot of institutions, be it
Yeah.
political, be it economic, be it scientific, so forth and so on, right? Especially within, the different faith systems we have too. So, how do you approach and interpret that change and evolution, that building up and breaking down
Yeah.
within these systems?
Yeah. Well, in this book that I mentioned that I wrote, Life After Doom, I refer to a little diagram that anyone who's studied biology, life sciences has seen. And really there's versions of this in astrophysics. It's an infinity loop, a little bit like one of those kind of a twisted Mobius strip. And the idea is that everything in biology, you could talk about it as a specimen, an individual animal, bird, tree, whatever, or
Mhm.
an ecosystem, or a whole species, or a whole ecosystem, or even a whole planet. It has this sort of cycle, and it starts with what they call an exploitation phase. The exploitation doesn't mean like in an immoral way. It just means there's a source of energy and resources
Right.
available that living things exploit. And then they try to conserve that and conserve that exploitation as long as they can. An example would be a forest develops and you have a climax forest that keeps going as long as I can, but eventually conditions change. And
Mhm.
so then there's a release phase when that organization that's been set in motion deteriorates. And then out of that release phase comes a reorganization phase that then leads to a new exploitation phase because the very release creates new resources that and energy that's available for something new to be born. And so this sort of cycle, cycle of life, uh, it, it's of course it shouldn't be unfamiliar to people in the Christian faith because it's very much, I think, what the Paschal mystery is about. It's about
Yeah.
life and then death and loss and then rebirth and new beginning. And so I I feel it's very, very hard for us to apply that to our own selves. As we, for me, as I get older, we all know theoretically we're going to die, but when you suddenly realize, oh, I'm making plans, I might not be around when this 10-year period is over. We then have to understand this applies to us. But maybe even less do we think about how it might apply to our economy and our civilization.
Right.
And when we imagine that economies and civilizations go through that same kind of process, then I'll just say for me, everything changes. We start seeing things differently.
Mhm.
Um, Let me just speak, if speaking about our own civilization, a civilization based on fossil fuels, but before it was based on fossil fuels, it was based on slave labor. And so you realize this system that made some of us very prosperous and brought a lot of comfort brought a lot of harm and difficulty to other people. So the very people who are mourning the end of a system might not realize that there are other people who are praying for the end of a system because it's exploiting them. And when we're able to hold that in our minds for even a couple of seconds, it maybe allows us to reach a little more of the humility we talked about before. Oh, of course, time has a very much longer arc than just one organization, one nation, one economic system.
Yeah, that's a good point. And to also follow up on what you were saying, I'm thinking of how Sister Kathy Duffy, who is also a great Teilhard scholar, she talks about this notion within the degradation of a system called the edge of chaos,
Yes,
and how when systems start to fall apart and approach that edge of chaos is when there is the greatest probability for creative union to happen, for
yes,
disparate parts to come together in a form
yes,
of union that doesn't take away their individual identities, yet rather highlights them and helps them grow in those identities. So, I mean, for me, that's something I'm always keeping in mind when, like you said, it seems like we approach the term of something and it might seem like something bad when for others, it's really a celebration of what's happening. It makes me think of, too, the word apocalypse, too, and how it
yes,
refers to this unveiling or revealing, and how some people are fearing the apocalypse, some people are living within it right now, some people are in the process of like a post-apocalyptic creating of a new world. And it's not just like the static event, but
yeah,
this dynamic unfolding that happens at different levels at different times.
yeah,
And that approaching it as the end times is not untrue in a way because it is the end of one time for the
yes,
beginning of a new yeah, in that way.
yes, yes. And this uh, for Christians, there's a passage where Jesus says, there will be wars and rumors of wars, but the end has not yet come. And when you hear the end, you think, oh, this is horrible. Things are going to get worse and worse and worse. But then he makes this analogy. He says, just as a woman in labor, experiences great pain, and then the pain is behind when the child is born.
Right.
By using that metaphor, he's saying, look, the end is not the end. The end is actually what's necessary for a new beginning of something else, for something new to be born. And of course, when we look at evolution, we've seen several major extinction events that are horrible in one sense, but in another sense, we realize, oh, those new forms of life couldn't have emerged if the old order hadn't been shaken, and so people who love capitalism. Well, capitalism could never have come into existence if feudalism hadn't sort of had a self-consuming nature to it, and feudalism wouldn't have emerged if systems before it hadn't, you know, uh, been insufficient. So, yeah,
Yeah, and I think of my own personal life and how in my own moments of spiritual or personal growth, it's usually very chaotic before that, and things are usually collapsing, and or at least they feel like they are. I don't
yes,
know if I come across that way to other people, but
yeah,
in those that I'm closest with, especially like sharing with my wife and stuff, I really feel like I'm at my wit's end,
yeah.
and that's at that point of release and letting go and surrender for something new to come through.
I mean, we see this play out on a planetary scale, on a cosmic scale, in human history, and we also see it play out in our own lives.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So you've been exploring this through your own theology, through your practice of that, through now some fiction. You've talked about a spiritual revolution that's necessary for us to survive. So,
Yeah.
what do you think that revolution might look like?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned Thomas Berry, and of course, Thomas Berry wouldn't have been possible without Teilhard,
Right.
a generation before. And Thomas Berry, in the last 40 years or so of his life, would frequently say this little kind of a litany. He said, I can describe our current situation in three sentences. First, the glory of the human is becoming the desolation of the earth.
Mm.
Second, the desolation of the earth is becoming the destiny of the human. For that reason, from this point forward, all human activities must be judged based on their contribution to a new mutually enhancing human earth relationship. And that little phrase, a mutually enhancing human earth relationship, it's so ironic. As soon as you read that and hear that, and you go back and you read the first couple of chapters of Genesis, you realize that human beings are put in this beautiful earth and they're supposed to respect limits.
Mm.
And they are unwilling to live within incredibly gracious, flexible limits. They even want to break, that limit. And then they're going to discover death, through that. And so this invitation goes all the way back to the early chapters of Genesis to re-enter a set of relationships where we stopped acting as if the earth belongs to us and we start acting as if we belong to the earth. And not just the earth as a geological reality, but this biosphere, and this living this living earth community. And when we understand that we will not exist unless we live in harmony with the larger realities, well, then that makes us say, well, how do we need to live with each other? And I have to say, as soon as I frame it that way, I realize that this is why I have stayed Christian through all the years of my life. And I know other people have made other choices, and I'm not condemning them in any way. But for me, the reason I've stayed Christian is because I think this is what Jesus was talking about, a new way to relate to reality. And that includes myself and my neighbor and my enemy. And it includes the birds of the air and the flowers of the field and the fish of the sea and the earth itself. And in relating to that totality of this unfolding, beautiful creation is I think, synonymous with how we relate to God, the spirit and presence of creativity that it animates this whole thing.
Yeah, you mentioned Thomas Berry. And when I was first getting into Thomas Berry and his idea of the Technozoic
Yeah.
and the Ecozoic, I was really, really struggling to see how do we dislodge ourselves from that entrancement that's the language he uses of the Technozoic, right? And I mean, I still have those moments where I'm like, there's no way. Like this is
Yeah.
just we are way too enmeshed within this. Um, but like I said, I like the garden and stuff like that, and spend a lot of time outside with my family. But it was really not until this past year I got into hunting, and it's just really opened my eyes in so many ways beyond just, oh, you're putting food on the table or whatever perspective people want to approach that with. But really, this deep relationship with
Yeah.
nature, an awareness of an animal and its patterns of life and the different seasons of its life and everything. And I'm just like, oh my God, if I were to only apply this spirit of the
Yeah.
hunt to my hunt of spirit of God in that way. It's
Yes.
like, it because it becomes all consuming. I said to my wife, like, I can't stop looking at maps and the terrain and stuff like
Yes.
that and reading stuff about deer. And it's like, it almost reminds me of like when I really got hungry for spirituality in
Yeah.
my early adult life and really was reading everything, consuming everything I could in that way. And you kind of have your peaks and valleys throughout life and you mellow out. And you might lose that sense of magic and entrancement in a way.
Mhm.
So it's been such a gift for me to be able to now learn this new hobby and skill and way of life in a way. But it's just opened me up spiritually in so many ways to see what Barry was talking about when he talks
Yes.
about the ecozoic and how all aspects of our life start to recenter around that ecozoic, from the economic spheres to the educational,
Yeah.
the medical, the religious. And when I see so much division in the world, I just ask myself, what are the causes that can bring us together where there's no argument about, what's right or what's wrong? And I just see the planet as one. And I know there are conflicting opinions about, the status of the planet and the concern for that. But I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that
Yeah.
humans are having an impact on the climate and the planet
Yeah.
in some negative ways. And we can work toward more of a homeostasis in some way. And I'm just speculating here, but I think the only way out of that entrancement of technology is through immersion in nature in some way. And I'm not saying
Yeah.
everyone needs to start, pick up a bow and start hunting or whatever it is, but in some way, like you said, just to walk through the pine needles, just to breathe fresh air,
Yeah.
just to listen to the bird song is just so critical and important. And I know I'm kind of talking long here, and you're my guest, and I want to turn it back to you. But just had one more thought because you've given so many powerful things to think about. You talked about that. What was it? The curve up of not exploitation.
It's yeah, it's called the adaptive cycle in biology, but
Okay.
exploitation, conservation, where you conserve, then release, and then reorganization.
Okay. Yeah, it makes me think of Teilhard's three-step process
Hmm.
of centration, decentration,
Yes.
and supercentration.
Yes.
We have to think about ourselves at
Yeah.
first. We have to develop a sense of our own identity, of who we are, of our capacities, so forth and so on. And then we decenter ourselves, we
Yes.
excenter ourselves, and we start to reach beyond that. And that takes a great vulnerability. And then it's not until that happens that we can be what Teilhard says is super centered or hyper
Yes.
centered
Yes.
on the all in that way. And I love your you being critical of that phrase "team human," which I think is more what's the word inclusive than maybe like "team us" or "team
Exactly.
me,"
Yes. Yes.
but it still misses that bigger picture of team
Yes.
life.
Yes.
And I just find that such a simple yet eloquent way to put it in terms of
Yeah.
team life, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually started using that term when I was trying to think, how do I talk about our situation with my grandchildren? Because you don't want to terrify people, you don't want to scare children, but you also don't want to pretend like there aren't challenges that they're going to face. And so the way I tried to explain it in a letter to my grandchildren is to say that a lot of humans forgot they were part of Team Earth and Team Life, and we're trying to remember and return to that deep awareness.
So just off the cuff here, Brian, what kind of inspiration do you get from your grandchildren?
Oh my goodness, so much, so much. Uh, you know, uh, I, I remember being in your stage of life where you have so much responsibility that it's that you don't have that much capacity. Your capacity gets limited to just enjoy what's going on because you have so much responsibility. And when you're a grandparent, you really don't have that much responsibility, but you're still a witness, and you're a witness with just as much love. And I'll just tell you this: you're simultaneously experiencing more love for your children than you've ever felt because you see them now as parents, and you have so much respect for your children. But then you watch these children with a certain kind of yeah, it's just this wonderful love that is uh, that is devoted without feeling the same responsibility you felt when you had your own children, and it brings great joy. And I think it also brings insight. Um, yeah,
Thank
yeah, but it's hard. It's hard to shut a grandparent up about that.
That's a good thing, though. It's a good thing. So, how do they inspire your hope for the future?
I'm not sure they, well, here's what I would say. They, you would, you would never, ever, ever want to tell your grandchildren or your children to despair. You would never want to tell your children or grandchildren there's no hope. And so when you feel tempted to despair, you in a sense, because of your love for your children or your grandchildren, you say we've got to find a way, um, even if we don't see the way. When I wrote this book, Life After Doom, the word doom tends to kind of suck the air out of the room, and I had to explain that I define the word doom not meaning that we have no hope, but doom is the feeling that comes over us when we feel that our problems are bigger than our solutions.
Mm.
And I think a lot of us have lived up until this very moment, always feeling that our solutions are bigger than our problems. Democracy will solve everything. Capitalism will solve everything. Religion will solve everything. Education will solve everything. And then, as you were saying before, we begin to see cracks in these things that we've had confidence in. And then we see the size of our problems growing. And that's when this sort of shiver goes up your spine where you say, oh no, our problems may be bigger than our solutions. And despair is what happens when you say, well, then there is no solution. But I think hope is what happens when you say, we've got to find a solution that we don't yet see. And we're committed to finding those solutions that we don't yet see. And those solutions might be deeper than we were willing to go before, or wider. They might involve collaborations that we weren't willing to participate in before. Um, but that's the process that I think happens. And I feel that I've been experiencing that, in the last 20 years of my life.
That's wonderful. And I think that your disposition as a contemplative in that way probably aids that, I would guess. Would you say that's true?
Well, I think one of the things that contemplation teaches you to do, it's a little bit, you've heard of fast food and then slow food or slow cooking.
Mhm.
Um, uh, in a way, you have fast thinking, which is reactive,
Mm.
which only reaches conclusions based on a thesis and that you've already a major and minor premise that you've already set in your mind. You can get to a snap decision, fast thinking. But when you're reduced to a place of wonder where you say, I don't know what's going on here, and now your thinking slows down, and it has to be conclusions have to be interspersed with curiosity. And so now you sit back and you just want to cultivate a kind of openness. So contemplation to me is a kind of slow thinking that it's not thinking. It's a kind of thinking that transcends our normal kind of thinking. It has to tell our normal kind of reactive, judgmental thinking to shut up for a while, to let some other kinds of thinking get a word in edgewise.
So you're telling me it's not like a large language model AI where it instantly gives you a very thorough response within the second? Yeah.
It just perfectly captures it. Uh,
Wow.
a large language model can only work with what's already been said.
Mm.
And when we reach places where the answers we need have never been said before, that's when we need a different kind. That's when we need not artificial intelligence, but we need true intelligence, which includes imagination and creativity and patience to wait for the unfolding of time,
Yeah.
as we were talking about before.
Yeah. Yeah. You're tapping into through that practice and process a deeper level of intelligence in that
Yes,
way. Some way. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
So, Brian, we're really grateful for all the time and wisdom and insight that you've shared today, especially since, like you said, you're taking a little hiatus from all this work that you've been so engaged in the world with, which, as too, I have to say, as a father, as a layperson, it's inspiring for me to see someone like you, yourself,
Well, thanks.
someone that has a family, grandchildren, and is able to do so much with your life. You're really exemplary in that way. So I look up to someone like yourself. Um, so I'm curious, how do you find synergy with the sacred in your own life?
Mm. Well, in terms of the very practical things, we mentioned them already, really. One is I every day do everything I can to get outdoors and and look for the logic that's written into the shape of the veins of a leaf, the pattern of veins on a leaf, or the flow of the seasons, or the undescribable wisdom. I live in Southwest Florida, and literally a block from where I live is a pair of eagles building their nest.
Mm.
And the other day, I watched this eagle leave its nest and fly out, and I think it looks like it's going to land and attack something, and it went down to the ground and pounced on something, and then the mate flew out and joined it on the ground. And I thought, what have they found? They each rose with bunches of grass clutched in their talons. And I realized they finished the stick structure of their nest, and now they want some soft grass. Tells me the time for eggs will be soon, laying eggs will be soon, because they're. And I just thought the wisdom that's in a bird constructing its nest, or singing its song, or knowing when and where and how to migrate. I mean, it's just so marvelous. So if I can stay connected to that wisdom and beauty, that plays a very big part in my life. And then there are many other things we could say, but another one is trying to stay reconciled with the people in my life. It's so easy to let conflicts emerge and your heart to grow hard, and to not be happy with writing people off, but to try to stay reconciled and try to keep room for mercy. Yeah, that's a very, very big part of it as well.
I really appreciate you ending with that because I think that's something that everyone in some capacity, and especially in these times of high division, could really lean into a little bit more. Being merciful with other people with different opinions, and
Yeah.
uh, opinions that might enrage us at times, but
Yeah.
how we can in some way approach that from a disposition of gentleness, tenderness, mercy in some way. Because ultimately, we need to extend that beyond humans too to the planet, right? And
It's so true.
yeah,
If we're going to get to a better place, I don't think it will be through better opinions. I think it will be through bigger and deeper love, and in the very act of the tension of differing opinions, if we can grow a bigger love, that may be our biggest contribution. Bigger contribution than our opinions, as important as we think they are.
I love it. I agree. I agree. And Brian, again, we're just really grateful for your time today. So, as we get ready to wrap up here, unless you have any other, thoughts you'd like to bless us with here, could you tell us? You mentioned you're in the process of writing right now.
Yeah.
So, are there any other projects you're working on, and how can people find out more about you and your work?
Yes. Well, my website is just my name, brianmclaren.net, BrianMclaren.net. I'm thinking that people, and of course, you can get my books on any online bookseller, or hopefully a neighborhood bookstore. You can order them if they aren't on the shelves. But I'm thinking of my books, the ones that might be most interest to people who are deeply interested in Teilhard and the things he cared about. I wrote a book some years ago called The Galapagos Islands: A Spiritual Journey. And it was a book where I got to go to the Galapagos Islands, write about it, and reflect on evolutionary thinking. And so I think people might find that helpful. For And then this book I wrote about our environmental situation that is also deeply resonant with ideas from Thomas Berry and Teilhard and others. I wrote a book called Life After Doom, and but this science fiction trilogy will also be of interest because it taps into so many of these issues we talked about. And the first volume of that is called The Last Voyage. It came out last year, and late next year the second will come out. It's called The Great Rift. And then in 2027, the third one will come out will be called Ethnogenesis. So
That's exciting. I'm gonna dive into those because I could use some good fiction right now.
I hope you'd enjoy it.
Yeah, yeah. I'll have to follow up with you for that. So, Brian, we are so grateful for, like I said, all of your time, all of your insight that you've blessed us with today. We look forward to maintaining this relationship in some way. Don't forget too, Brian has a podcast too through the Center for Action and Contemplation. So you can tune into that and, see all the plethora of guests he has as well. We're very grateful for being able to connect, for the friends that have connected us, and for this technology too. I know we've kind
That's
of
right.
spoken in a way, thrown a little bit of shade or concern toward technology, but ultimately it's not a replacement for an in-person
Right.
connection, but it allows us great possibilities. So we're very grateful for being able to connect personally, and then for all of you who have joined us in some capacity. So Brian, thank you so much.
Thank you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you too. You too.